Hello, everyone. We'll give it just a couple moments for everyone to come through and hop on to our session. But first and foremost, I want to welcome you all to the fourth and final panel of our World Strategy Day celebration. Stay tuned after we finish this panel. There will be a strategy execution workshop and the option to network and do some roundtables at the end. So the fun doesn't stop here. But I am very excited to introduce you all to our final panelists and our final topic of the day around chaos, which is that of minimizing the cost of chaos. And something I think we'll talk through a lot here is the opportunities that you can capitalize on through chaos and how we really bring that to life. The big discussion point for this panel is, again, minimizing the cost of chaos. And we're going to be talking about this a lot through the lens of MVPs, or minimum viable products. Something that you've heard throughout a lot of the sessions today, and something I really picked up on is, how do we make decisions when we have conflicting information or so much information or so many different stakeholders? How do we know what to prioritize on and lean into during times of chaos? And MVPs, or minimum viable products, are a really great way to test things, learn from them quickly, and make sure you're making the right investments or optimizing the way those investments come to life. So when we think about an MVP, this is going to be a small subset of a bigger initiative that has leading indicators attached to it and helps you test the viability of a big initiative before going all in. And these are typically run for a much shorter period of time than the big investment would be, again, to really help you understand if it's the right investment and how to learn fast and adapt. Before we jump into the details, I'd love to introduce everyone that we have on the panel today. First off, my name is Danielle Latimore. I work in customer strategy and operations at Cascade, and am very excited to be mitigating this panel with Jennifer, Jay, and Scott. So Jennifer Riel is joining us from IDEO. She is the global director of strategy there, and she collaborates with many of their clients to push the edges of creative problem solving, leveraging tools from strategy and design thinking. So she's worked a lot across many different industries and countries to help organizations really build winning, sustainable, and human-centered strategies. We are also joined by Jay Gouliard, who joins us from Mondelez International, where he is currently serving as the Senior Vice President of Research and Development. And he oversees many areas of the business, including packaging and design, sustainability, across all markets, categories, and brands. And he brings lots of innovation and design success as well from the food, beverage, snacks, home care, and personal care industries. Last but not least, we have Scott Lichtenthal, who is joining us from MasterCard. He is the Senior Vice President of Insights and Analytics Products, where he leads several lines of business and an associated portfolio of B2B products and services. So as you can see, we have a variety of folks on the call today, many diverse and interesting perspectives, and I'm so excited to dig into MVPs and minimizing the cost of chaos with you all today. So I'd like to start the discussion off today with making sure that we're all aligned on what an MVP could look like. And I think a good place to start is with an example of an MVP that one of our panelists has run. So Jennifer, I'd love to maybe kick things off with you. If you could take us through an MVP that you've run in your experience. I'd love to know, what did you want to test? How did you do it? And what were your findings at a high level?
Thanks, Danielle. So I wanted to pick an example that was maybe not as directly about a product, because I think when you hear MVP, quite logically, you think about how you're going to test the product. And in this case, we actually were helping to explore the idea of bringing a Japanese brand to the United States. And there were a whole series of questions that they really wanted to understand, yes, about viability, but also feasibility and desirability. And so what we wanted to really do was get past the basic beginning, which was user research to understand the true market opportunity in the United States. And there's only so far you can get by engaging with people without actually giving them something to try, right? An actual behavioral test. And so what we did was create the skeleton of an online store. We used Shopify, and then created a series of different value propositions that the brand could use in market entry. So slightly nuanced, different versions of how they might show up in the United States, some very close to how they were showing up in their market, and some that were a little further out. And then we invested in a few ads on social media sites, and it was amazing how quickly you could get to statistical significance and meaningful understanding just by launching those ads. People would click through to the site, purchase, click to add to basket. And so we could get real human behavior as opposed to sentiment or attitude. We actually got to understand to what extent a percentage of people seeing these ads would click through, and therefore get a much better sense of which of the value propositions were resonating. So this was really a desirability test. And we were able to very, very quickly, in a matter of a couple of weeks, get to a degree of confidence around what this value proposition could be that we wouldn't have been able to get without standing up something like an MVP of the value proposition online.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for sharing that example. And I would love to, excuse me, I'd love to hear you build on that in the context of the theme for the panel of minimizing the cost of chaos. How did running this MVP minimize the cost of chaos for you? Are you able to put like an ROI or savings number to that this enabled you with? Oh, and Jennifer, sorry, that was directed at you on this example.
I'm sorry, I thought we were going to Jay. So we were really interested in thinking about this from a savings point of view. We spent a few $100s in order to understand which value proposition was compelling. And the reason it was so important was that it turned out that the value proposition that the client thought was right, that was closest to how they show up in their current market, tested far and away lowest. It just did not resonate with US markets. And so for us, this was really about spending a few $100s in a couple of weeks to prevent doing a silly thing at scale, right? That's really the driver of the reason you would do this. Silly things at scale are really easy to do if you don't have those early tests that help you make better decisions about where to invest and where not to invest. They wouldn't have believed us when we said that value proposition isn't going to resonate. Trust us, we know the market. Or here are a few interviews from a few consumers who suggest that this isn't going to work. It was really only when we could show the behavioral patterns that it made the real difference.
That's fascinating. And I think what you said there around before making a big, silly investment, testing first to make sure that you're putting your dollars and your resources and investment behind things that you have confidence will work. So I'd love to hear from Jay next around a time that you maybe ran an MVP in your organization where there was significant ROI, or where you had learnings, or maybe where you participated in something and ran it at scale that actually didn't have the impact you thought it would. Either example from your business.
Okay. Thanks, Danielle. I think I'll talk about the silly at scale comment that Jennifer made, because I have a great example from my past life at another company. And it was really a time where I regretted not taking the opportunity to conduct an MVP. And this is a case where we would have not only avoided the costs, both financial and human, but also we could have avoided a lot of embarrassment and disappointment with some of our key customers. So a number of years ago, I was supporting a business where we thought we knew our customers just so very well. And we were the industry leader. We were successful in driving innovation into this category many, many times. And in fact, we led the category in innovation in both product and packaging. And we knew that our consumers liked to interact with our product and even appreciated a certain level of complexity in that interaction. And we call that level of complexity the puzzle effect. So we began the development of a new innovation, knowing our consumer needs and desires were, and we spent 3 years developing this new innovation for the market. The other element to note is the fact that we committed to our key customers to a firm, full market launch date that we knew we could meet. The team ran off. We did the design, we did the development work, we tested the concepts with consumers initially at the beginning of the project, and it was full speed ahead. We followed this with building pilot molds in order to technically validate the design. And then we moved into the design and fabrication of production molds that could serve the market. After 3 years and spending about $6 million in capital investments, we were ready to launch with our key customers, but we wanted to check before we actually made the launch to make sure that our consumers were happy with the innovation and that we were meeting all of the needs and desires with this new innovation. And as it turned out, unfortunately, we found out that our consumers were rejecting the innovation after 3 years of development and $6 million of investment. The design didn't resonate with these new potential users, and the complexity that we thought they wanted really wasn't what they were looking for. With a committed launch date, we really needed to scramble to find an alternative innovation that we could deliver to our customers to meet the commitments and not lose the shelf space that we had intended for this new innovation. I guess maybe a side note is we lost a lot of credibility when we had to switch from this brand new innovation to something that we were going to backfill it with that didn't have the impact in the marketplace that the original one we expected to have. This was a huge embarrassment for the commercial team and a major failure in R&D. And had we had the foresight and the commitment to conduct an MVP with product produced from the pilot mold, we could have avoided all of the costs and all of the embarrassment and all of the delays in the timelines. And in this particular example, we actually traded off the risk of potentially exposing our new innovation to a highly competitive market with the risk of failure at launch. And then unfortunately, the risk of failure at launch became reality for us in this example. And it was so costly. And it's a great example how an MVP, had we had the foresight to do it, could have avoided the losses and enhanced the chance of commercial success for this particular innovation. It was really a hard lesson that we learned, and it was talked about for many years after that failure. Everyone said, remember the day where you spent $6 million in 3 years of investment, 3 years of people time and human time and resource time, only to find out that the launch was not successful. So it was a hard lesson to learn, and those lessons don't go away very easily.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that, Jay. And I think what's so interesting about that example is you said at the beginning, there was some kind of consumer research to see if this was something they had an appetite for. But interestingly, the key would have been running an MVP again mid-cycle as the rubber was really starting to hit the road to start building on top of that. So Scott, I'd love to turn it over to you and hear a little bit more in your experience. I'd love to hear some insights from you around ROI as it relates to MVPs, but also thinking of Jay's example, how we actually determine what we want to measure to prove the success of an MVP and when the timelines and milestones are right to actually do that. So big question over to you, Scott, but I'd love to hear your take.
That is a big question. And it's really interesting having heard Jennifer and Jay's response of neither of them said, here's the ROI, but one thing they did say is, here's the cost we avoided, and here's the cost that we took on. And that's a really important piece because that's how you avoid those silly things at scale. It's how are you taking into account the costs that you're going to be avoiding in the future by making those wrong decisions. And that's really the purpose of an MVP in many ways. And it's your objective is how do you reduce future risk? How do you reduce future cost? And you do it in the lowest cost way possible, in the quickest way possible. And how do you do this? You do this with a plan. You need to have a plan, and you need to be ready to change that plan. And so what does that plan look like? You have to know where's the destination you're going? How do you pair it back to its smallest thing? How do you shorten that decision cycle? And then how are you ready to change? So one guideline to make it a little more real is that I just say that decision cycle needs to be 3 months or less. And obviously, it's going to be different in every industry, and that's a guideline. But if you're not making a decision in 3 months, you're probably waiting too long. And I'd love to make that 3 weeks. I'd love to make that 3 hours. But that typically is that decision point. And if you don't make a decision in 3 months, the decision needs to be that you have to be ready to shut down and not scale. Because if you haven't proved it's not silly, it's silly. So one phrase I personally like to use with my team is, imagine you're driving from New York to California. And I'm based in New York, as you can tell from some of the leaves behind me. You start by just going west. And so you have your destination in mind. You know you're going to California. You're not going down to the minutia of turn left on this street or this or that street, but you're getting started. You're going west. And you're retaining the optionality of, do I ultimately want to end up in California? Do I want to go down to Mexico? Do I want to go up to Canada? We don't know yet, but we only know there by getting started, by going west, and you're retaining that optionality. You've retained the ability to go any direction you want, or even to turn back and say that wasn't right without having to take a full flight to California. Now, to make it real, one of the products in my portfolio, it's called MasterCard's Customer Data Enhancement. It helps you connect MasterCard's spend insights to your CRM, so on an individual basis. And at a high level, a number of years ago, the value proposition was very obvious. If you're an airline, if you're a retailer, you know everything about what your customer does within the four walls of your establishment, within your application. But as soon as they leave, you become blind. Whereas we're able to understand some of those trends. And how do we connect those together? That being said, it's a really complex challenge in terms of like, why is that important? What are they actually going to do with that insight? How do we get started? And it would be a multi-million-dollar project, would have been, just get started there and try to cover the full gamut. And it probably would have failed. What we had done was something a little bit different, is that we had started with just consulting engagements, and we had made a number of partners of, can we do this with consulting, sit down with a customer and say, hey, can we help you out? Can we connect this? And we did that 2 times. We did that in 2 cycles, and allowed us to move towards an understanding of like, yes, we understand the value proposition. We now know what we want to do. And once you know what you want to do, the MVP process continues. It just changes. And so it moved from, is it the right MVP value proposition, similar to the example Jennifer had with the Shopify page, to, is it the right way of standardizing? Is it the right way of productizing it? Is it the right feature? This MVP mindset continues end to end. But the important thing is you always have to keep it to, are you moving west? Are you making those small, short decisions that are forcing you to get to the longer destination over time?
I love that analogy, Scott. And I think that is a really good theme as we talk about today, especially in this landscape and economic environment. I think consistently testing throughout the journey and making sure that you're continuing to move in the right direction really is key here. And Jennifer, I'd love going back to your earlier example. I know you talked about a lot of your learnings from it, but what really was the key thing that helped you determine if you should or shouldn't move forward? What was that particular milestone? And did you have anything in mind that you were going to continue testing from that point?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the example I shared was a very specific question that needed to be answered. And I think building on what Scott and Jay were saying, I mean, this idea of heading west, right? You start with the biggest unknown, the most important question, and really take the word minimum seriously, right? We tend to want to test a whole bunch of things at once. We tend to want to layer things in. And before long, you are getting to scale and you're conflating things in a way that it's really hard to understand which of the variables you've shifted has influenced the outcome. And so following the scientific method, right, you want to be able to say, we're going to test this thing. This is the thing I want to know. This is the thing I want to understand. This is what I'd expect the outcome to be. Like passing the test looks like this in advance, specifying what success would be, because we delude ourselves. We're like, well, that's more or less a pass, right? More or less. So you want to define in advance what passing the test would be. And design the smallest test that you can design. It could be, depending on what you're testing, 2 days, $200 to understand something fundamental. In the case of the example that I used, the first thing to understand was what the value proposition needed to be, because that would inform where you were showing up, your further channel choices, how you were going to do marketing and brand awareness building. And so we started there, and there were a whole series of tests that followed that got increasingly bigger or more market facing. Having an in-store test with a retailer is significantly more complicated, significantly more work required in order to get that stood up. And so we didn't start there. We started with something where we could really control, turn on and turn off the ecosystem in a way that made sense for this particular brand as they were just getting going. But as you go further along, you're going to figure out what are those larger scale tests that really build confidence. Because that's ultimately what this is about, is not getting to absolute certainty, but getting to the level of confidence to make a real choice and then take action on it.
I love that. I think your point around continuously testing, but not getting stuck in this cycle of always testing, never acting is another very critical piece of this. Obviously, when resources are slim, and just in general, it's important to act and to continue capitalizing on things so you don't run out of time to actually make your impact too when those opportunities come up. Jay, I saw you nodding your head a lot as Jennifer was talking through that. I'd love to hear a little bit about your experience with some other MVPs that you've run, and kind of what the learnings were along the way, or how that methodology built on itself throughout the execution of an MVP within a larger initiative.
Yeah, I think we consider the MVP process to be a learning process. It's not an end all. It's an experiment that leads to an experiment that leads to an experiment, or an improvement that leads to an improvement that leads to an improvement, based on the knowledge that you gain from that first step. And so it's a learning process for us in the product development world. And it's an opportunity to use transactional decisions from consumers to teach us about what's important to them. And there are lots of different things that we can measure, just like Jennifer mentioned. I mean, value proposition is something that's really key to us. Pricing, product design, whether it's texture or flavor or format, the packaging design, the preference that the consumer might have over this product or over another. The performance of the MVP or the eventual end product in different channels. We often do MVPs in different channels to see how that product would perform either in the traditional grocery store or the convenience store or petrol station or a big box retailer like Sam's Club or Walmart. So we have a lot of different uses for an MVP. We also use it to understand how the consumer is going to use our product sometimes, and then we can tailor the design to fit the consumer use. Incrementality is really important for us. So when we're launching a new product, if we're not seeing a lot of incrementality for the innovation, then sometimes that's a red flag that we're not doing the right things. And then we measure things like a number of turns that we might see in the marketplace for an MVP. So how often does the consumer want to purchase this product? And oftentimes our commercial partners and the business in general looks at an MVP not as a test and learn, but they look at it as a test and launch. So we go out there with the intention of learning, gaining knowledge, and revising the product and re-engineering the product in order to meet the consumer need. But there's all this pressure from the commercial side to go forward fast. And so you have to draw a line, on what you're going to do. What does success look like? What are those success criteria? And then set up with the right testing protocol around the MVP in order to ensure that you meet it. If you don't set up success criteria, as engineers and scientists, we'll do MVPs forever, because it will never be good enough for us. So you really have to be clear on what are those success criteria. And when you meet those success criteria, let's get out there and launch that product. As you mentioned, acting and not just testing all the time is extremely important.
Yeah, I think clarity in the success criteria is just so pivotal from everything we've heard in all of the different panels today. More and more stakeholders are involved at more and more different times throughout the process. So if there isn't clarity and alignment on what success looks like and when we are sure we want to hit go, it's going to make that process of ultimately hitting go or waiting until the appropriate moment to hit go a lot harder, because you'll be dealing with these competing opinions. Scott, I'd love to hear from you. You talked a little bit about methodology earlier around MVPs, but Jay touched on another great point, which is that, you may be looking at launching a new product or optimizing a different product, moving it into a different channel, or, expanding in a certain way. How do you do business casing within your organization when there's a million different things you could test and a million different directions you could go? How do you decide what to test?
Yeah, I think a lot of it links back to something Jay had mentioned about this needs to be always on. So there always needs to be new MVPs being built, and there always needs to be the next business case. But something else Jay had mentioned, which was the risk of analysis paralysis, the risk of never actually acting. So I like to think about the business case process as being built on how do we manage what really is the highest cost of an MVP, which is that opportunity cost. So you could be doing a million different experiments, but you only have the time, the focus to do 1 experiment, 2 experiments, 3 experiments, whatever your capacity is. And so your goal should be, how do I innovate without creating that undue opportunity cost, while I'm innovating on the right things? And to me, that comes down to really 3 big things that come into setting the right process, building the right cases, and enabling your team. The first item is ring fencing resources, protecting resources. And I know when I say resources, the first thing comes to mind is money or people, but Jennifer had mentioned $200. And at least at an organization like MasterCard, that's not the challenge. The challenge in ring fencing is mind share, making sure that you have the right mindset and people focused on taking time to do MVPs. Time is the most valuable asset in this case, as well as the focus on doing testing and learning. I actually usually recommend 2 separate processes, one for the problems you already are working on, and then having a separate mindset for what are new problems we can be working on, because that's going to spread the aperture even wider as to making sure that you're not stuck in your biases of this is how we've always done it, but you actually have a focused effort on, do we have MVPs to actually challenge the status quo? Second item is enabling the teams to find the right problems. And this is that business case, but it's kind of what Jay described as it's part of a learning process. And so a lot of the focus should be on, do you have the right problems? Are you acting on those problems? And do you have the right measurements in place? And internally, we use a product called MasterCard's Test and Learn. But even if you don't have a product to guide that, as long as you are always reevaluating, is this the right product or the right problem to focus on? Are we actually making progress on it? And if not, that gets to the third point, is you as a leader, or you as of the MVP process should be really focused on being ready to shut it down. It is amazing how hard it is for anyone to let go of their baby if their baby is the MVP. And you do need to be data-based. You do need to be measurement-based. You need to come in with a default of, I'm going to shut down this MVP. And also the default of, by shutting down this MVP, I've avoided something silly. That's a massive success. And some of the most formative points in my experience have been when I've shut down products that I've launched. And I am as excited, and you need to help everyone else, including yourself, be excited by, we were able to disprove this with $200 in 3 months, and we avoided $6 billion, and it being the inside joke at Mondelez for X number of years to come. So those are the big 3 for me in the business process, which is protecting and ring fencing those resources, especially the mind share, enabling teams to find the right problems and learn, that continuous learning process, and then being ready to shut down and really having a keen focus on being happy with shutting down.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Scott. And actually, I can see there's a lot going on in the chat. There's a lot of things that you've said that really resonated with people. And actually, something I do want to address in the chat and kind of raise to our panelists is that we are talking a lot about minimizing the cost through the lens of a chaotic environment. And obviously, it's great to be putting these guardrails and structure around new things you might test, new innovations, new opportunities. But when something big and chaotic comes and hits you in the face as you're going through your day-to-day business processes, how do you take all the learnings and findings we've discussed here into making strategic decisions and running even faster, more urgent MVPs if you need to in the face of chaos? And I see you all kind of nodding your head. I'm not sure if someone wants to jump in first on that, but I know our audience would love to hear some tips.
Yeah, I can start us off. So I think, our focus on MVPs, whatever you want to call them, small experiments, whatever it might be, tying that to the idea of navigating chaos. I think for me, the first thing is you do want to build the muscles as much as you can before the chaos hits you. Easy to say in retrospect, but it is a powerful thing to do, is to have a shared language, a set of systems, the structures in place, the management systems in place to enable you to do this. And then the principles don't change in moments of chaos. There are less clear signals. It may be harder to know exactly what you want to test. But in that case, I actually think, again, going back to the idea of taking minimum seriously, you might actually launch a few different small experiments to help you make sense of some of that chaos and where the world is heading, in order to help you determine what it is you want to start to invest in and build. So what I do is say, you know, what would have to be true for me to be able to navigate through this period of chaos? What would have to be true for this new venture to work in this new, much more complicated, fast changing world? And the reason that MVPs are most applicable to me in a world of chaos is that the alternatives to MVPs are waiting, as Jay described, the sort of keep building it, make it perfect internally, and then you didn't actually get to the place of fully launching it and watching it fail in the marketplace, which would have been an even worse outcome than the embarrassment that you faced, or doing nothing, right? Like just hoping that the chaos starts to clear. But I would be thinking about how you use your testing and experimentation mindset to start to find patterns in the chaos.
Scott or Jay, anything that you'd add on that from your experience?
Yeah, what I'd add, and there's a framework called the Sign-Off-In framework, which is types of problems that typical people work on. And there's a typical, like, obvious problems that most people don't spend their time on. But then there's complex and complicated problems where you spend a lot of our time. And that's the day in, day out that we focus on. But if you think back 3-4 years to when COVID hit, there's a point at some point where these items happen where it changes the patterns, and those complex and complicated become chaotic. You don't know what to do. And as Jennifer said, that muscle memory becomes so important in those times of chaos, because at some point chaos will regress back to complex or will regress back to complicated. And so as much as it's way easier said than done, but if you think about return to office or any of these other types of policies, 3 years ago, that was chaos. We did not know what to do, but today it's complicated, and it's regressed back to a normal kind of item that you can test and learn. And so as much as you can exercise that muscle memory through chaos, it's how you persevere through chaos, and it's how you set yourself up for success coming out of that slingshot of chaos.
Amazing. Thank you. And Jay, is there anything else that you'd add from your end before we jump into Q&A? I know there's a lot more questions to dive into.
Yeah, I just maybe build on what Jennifer said. It's important for us, in order to get through the chaos quickly, to do MVPs in different markets. We have global brands, and we're trying to learn as much as we can. And so we do a lot of things in parallel to get through the learning phase as quickly as we possibly can, and implement those changes and get beyond the MVP into a full launch. And I would say, and I want to make this point, is that MVPs mean different things to different companies in different industries. I've, of course, spent most of my career in food and beverage and personal care, where there are a lot of things that we have to check the box on before we can launch an MVP. Things like product and food safety, we will not compromise. We have to have a safe product hitting the marketplace for our consumers, because we don't want anything to happen in the market. We need to make sure that all the compliance and regulations are being met with the products that we're launching. So there are a lot of things that you need to consider before you go out. You just can't throw anything at the wall and hope it sticks, because we've got brands that mean a lot to our consumers. They're trusted. And if we do some things to compromise the integrity and trust the consumer has in the brand, it goes counter to what we want to accomplish through our innovation process. And we do. It is a policy within our organization to not launch anything globally or anything across an entire market unless we do an MVP. So we've really embedded it in the culture of the company. And there's an expectation that we're going to do an MVP or a test and learn. We're going to gain knowledge. We're going to learn from that. We're going to do what we need to do in order to improve that innovation, and go out and test again and then launch. So it's something that just becomes core to how we do our innovation in our company. So I think it's really important to remember that it just doesn't happen ad hoc every once in a while. We don't have a set budget for this or a set number of MVPs that we want to do. It's just something that we do all of the time.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jay. And I'd love to now get into a little bit of Q&A. We have just some time here. So many great questions in the chat, but let's jump into the first one here. So there is always risk in innovation. In an MVP, what would be the right approach to identify and minimize risk? And I think this actually pairs really nicely with what you were just speaking to, Jay, that it's a part of your core operating rhythms at this point. But what is the right approach to identify and minimize risk? We'll open that to anyone who wants to jump in. Again, Jay, I think and Scott, I see you came off mute. Go for it.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So identifying and minimizing risk. The important thing is identifying the question you're trying to solve. And Jennifer touched on this before of picking one question at a time in part of that scientific method of having, like, what is the issue you're trying to solve? And once you narrow that issue into what you're trying to solve and determine, is that the biggest problem? Naturally from that will come, what are the biggest risks associated with that? Because the risks are the problem that you're solving. And so that natural phase of what is the most important problem I want to solve, build an MVP against that. The goal will be, and again, if this doesn't come out naturally, to Jay's point, with test and learn, it's good to sometimes systematize this in saying what's the biggest risk here. But your biggest problem to solve should also be your biggest risk. So thinking about risks separate from opportunity might be the wrong paradigm, but instead thinking what's the most important problem that is going to derail this product? Is it the customer value proposition? Because then that's a risk. Or is it the financials? Or is it the pricing? Or is it the packaging? That will help drive that biggest risk decision identification.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. And jumping into the next question here. So is it better to focus on minimizing the cost or perhaps rather on maximizing the opportunity from chaos? And I know we've had some comments around here on the opportunity cost being the biggest cost. Scott, you shared that. So maybe Jay or Jennifer on your end, what would you say to this?
I mean, for me, it's hard to answer in the abstract, right? It really depends on the nature of the question in front of you and the context of your organization. There are absolutely some conditions under which focusing on minimizing the cost of chaos is the right thing to do. But in this moment, you might also say, well, what is the size of the opportunity, and actually look at them together. I'm thinking about the amount of chaos that financial services and consumer goods have had over the last 4 years. And I think that there were likely some spaces where saying we can cautiously mitigate some risk here was the right and prudent thing to do. And other cases where saying, oh, there's a significant shift in consumer behavior here that we think may be long lasting. That feels like a moment to drive forward. And I would just want to amplify one thing from the last question, which is at the opening of the question was, there's always risk in innovation. There is always risk in not innovating. And we forget that embedded risk. And you want to be able to hold the status quo choices you're making to the same level of standard of proof that you are applying to the new innovation.
Fantastic. And I think this is our final question here. So again, please jump into the roundtables or do some networking after the event if you want to keep the conversation going. But how to create and maintain the organizational appetite to keep trying new and different. So I think this speaks to a lot of cultural elements around the organization. Jay, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in your experience.
Yeah, I think the way we've approached MVPs and test and learns is we use case studies and examples. So we might have done 10 MVPs in a region or in a category in our business, and we use those examples of how that MVP and how that process has actually benefited the business. We didn't launch a product that wasn't successful. we didn't spend an inordinate amount of money developing a final product that we could never launch because the consumers rejected it in the end. So internally, those case studies have a lot of power. Our regions and our business units are very competitive. And if they see a business unit who's used MVPs very successfully to grow their business, then it's contagious. It's like a virus. It travels across our business very well and very quickly. And no secrets when it comes to success. And so it's just something that sort of happens organically within the company. But we do have an expectation, as I mentioned, that all of our business units will use MVPs and test and learns prior to going to a market launch. So we have a lot of examples of how using these types of tools can really drive value for the business in the end and really produce products that the consumers really love and sit right at the heart of what they desire. So we talk to each other and we sort of have, as I mentioned, a competitive environment across the business. And so it works really well in order to embed this type of technology or these types of tools with the business.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much. I know we could have talked about this topic for hours more. So again, if anyone wants to stick around and join some networking later on, I want to invite you all to join our strategy execution workshop, which is going to be happening next. So stay tuned for that as well. And thank you so much, Jennifer, Scott, and Jay, for joining us today.
Thank you, Danielle.
For having us.